Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back with another episode. I'm absolutely thrilled today to have with me Phil Oakley. Phil, first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Tom. You're generous
Phil,
to have me.
Phil, you've got a couple of books out and perhaps a little bit more you can tease us with later, but it's a really interesting series that I can't wait to get into with you. But before we do that, you've also had an equally interesting professional background. And I was wondering if you might be able to tell us a little bit about that. And of course, Hook 'em Horns.
Thanks. A&M University Press publishes this thing, so I got to play both ends on it, but I'm with you. I've had a wonderful life, and one of the reasons I've had so many experiences is because I've been fortunate enough to live so long. I was corresponding with another one of the Stony Creek authors this morning, and I sent my mind way back to when I was 21 years old and really full of vinegar, young reporter. And I got a great thrill out of sparring with John Connolly, and he seemed to tolerate it. He laughed a lot, even though nobody else was laughing. But I always wanted to do something. I grew up listening to the radio because that's all there was when I was a child. And I just thought it would be great if I could be one of those news people on the radio. And I got my dream come true on that. And I got to work for ABC, and they became the Walt Disney Company. I got to make movies. That was another one of my great wishes for life. And I got to write books. And that's what's so fun these days.
Let me detour just a little bit because it dawned on me you might have known Ronnie Dugert.
I did. He was,
And I have to tell everyone he passed away today. I've never had the chance to visit with anyone who knew him personally. Could you just say a few words about Ronnie and what he meant to journalism in Texas?
He made it. A lot of our older readers are going to be familiar with Molly Ivins, and she became a great celebrity. But she was, like most of us, one of his disciples. We kind of followed him around. And I was 10 or so years young, well, more than that, a little more than 10 years younger than he was. But there was nobody in my long journalistic career who was ever more dedicated than Ronnie Duggar and to get to the truth. And there's a whole lot of stuff between the surface and the truth in Texas politics. So he was a great inspiration. He never gave up. He never flinched. He never made any money. And I don't think he ever cared whether he did or not. But he was a thorn in the side of every politician who ever walked through those Capitol doors down there. And I wanted to be able to do what I could like that. And I became good friends with one of his early followers, Greg Olds, who is still alive. But Ronnie was just an idol. He was just something to admire and hope you could do as good as.
I came to him through one of my mentors was Willie Morris, and Willie wrote lovingly about Ronnie. But I just couldn't pass up that chance to ask you for a few words about him. But let's go to your books now, because I was fascinated to begin to understand the framework of your story. It starts with a book called Little Hatchet. Book number 2 is called Runners. So can I maybe ask you what inspired you to write this story about this family? And I'm not going to say this time because it's probably going to go on 100 years.
Yeah, it does. But my two grandparents, Ada and Walter Oakley, were the most wonderful people I've ever known. I've lived a long time now. I've met and covered a number of presidents. I've covered popes. I got to be in the same room several times with now St. Teresa. And they're all great people. But the people closer to you, when they're great, you can't help but want to live up to what they show you. And the tragedy that they endured was one of the most remarkable shows I've ever had the opportunity to watch. Not because they really lacked for anything, but because they had done so well in building a great part of what we know as Texas. They didn't get rich. They weren't oil people or anything like that. but they were people you could trust. They were people you could depend on. And for years after he was dead, I would run into people who knew my grandfather when they were young. He might have married him. He was a justice of the peace. He might have provided them with a home. He might have given them food. And the stories just never stopped. And people talked with reverence about it. People that I'd never met before. And the lady who just absolutely put starch in my collar was my grandmother. And she raised 8 children. And she had come from a big family, and my grandfather had come from a big family. And they got married very young and they started having children. And it's just a remarkable story. And it goes on and on. And my father, at 14 years old, decided that the best thing he could do in life was go out and ride a freight train to California. And I can't imagine the horror they felt when they found out their son was stranded way out in West Texas after encountering a deputy sheriff who knew my grandfather and called him up and said, "I got your boy out here." Sounds like Huck Finn, harmless. It wasn't, but it was an adventure to him. And he was bored. He was always bored. He always had to do something bigger, something faster. He was as good as anybody. And but he wasn't, he didn't brag about it. He had his faults, and they were very deep and very tragic often. And that was a common thread through that generation of my family. They had grown up in such a model family as children. And jazz age, prohibition, drinking, even crime for 2 of them, serious crime. They all found their way into those lives. And somehow or another, my grandparents never gave up. They never stopped loving them. And there was nothing that they could do that made them abandon their children. So that's what got me started. So I was going to write a biography of my grandfather, but I struggled with that for years trying to make it work. And finally, I decided I don't know, I don't have enough specifics to do something nonfiction. Let's make it a novel. And eventually, it has become 3 novels.
I'd like to turn now. I love talking to writers about the craft of writing, and your story here is unique. But I'd really to maybe start with you started down one direction, as you said, the biography of your grandfather, and then it switched. There's another not novel, a work of nonfiction that involves Jews coming to Texas from Europe, the immigration of Jews. And it started out as a woman writing what she thought was her family's biography. And then she uncovered this entire program in Europe prior to World War I, where Jews were shipped through Galveston into Texas as immigrants. And so I was fascinated when you said, I made this shift. Could you talk about how you made that shift and what it meant for your writing and the story that you ended up with?
It changed everything entirely because that way I could paint portraits of these people that I love so much. That way I could put myself in their lives and their heads and try to figure out the right words so that I could put the readers there with me. And that was just a complete shift. And it happened in the most unlikely way.
And the first book, I think you started it called Little Hatchet. You started it in the years after the Civil War. I was also intrigued how not so much you incorporated history, but you incorporated Texas into your books. And was that through research? You've obviously lived a full life, but there are parts and places of Texas you may not have lived in prior to writing the book. How did that part of your work come together?
Well, there's not much of this state I haven't seen up close and personal, either as a journalist or as a lifelong explorer of Texas. There's, what does the song say? There are miles and miles of Texas. Well, and around every corner, there's something different, something new, something dangerous, something exciting. And I love trains. And we lived by the railroad track most of my life. Still do. I can hear the freight trains all the time from here. But I knew what my grandfather had done as a career in real life, but that didn't work too well for the story. So I decided the ideal thing would be to have this bright young man become a surveyor for the Southern Pacific Railroad as it began to cross Texas, headed for California. And there was a race on. The Southern Pacific was in a race with the Texas and Pacific to be the first to El Paso, which is where everything would come together. And the second transcontinental railroad, not the one you read about in the history books, but the one down here, took place. And the kinds of adventures that I knew of from having read lots of other stories from other people that it took to build those railroads and the influence they had on the development of the state. These days, we think of things like DFW Airport as being the economic engine that has driven so much growth in North Texas. But those railroads were live or die. If the railroad went around your little town, there was no town. And that happened over and over again. And people actually fought to get the railroad to come through. But building across the Pecos River Gap is one of the biggest engineering challenges in America. And it's full of it's full of real stories, and it was a great place to set some exciting fictional stories. The border, running back and forth across that border, has been going on as long as Europeans have been on this continent. And it was a fascinating place then. It was riveting for people's attention, and it very much so is still today.
That time period, Texas was still the frontier. And I just read something about the Battle of Adobe Wells, which reminds us all that it was not only a wild and woolly frontier, but it was a frontier contested by various groups. Could you say a few words about the Indians and what the Anglos and Indians, how they finally came to something together?
I don't really quite understand that they ever got there, except for the fact that the one thing I was determined not to do when I wrote about Native people was to repeat the cliches off the Western movies I saw as a kid. They were demeaning, and they weren't based on any real truth. They were just based on wild stories because people love wild stories. And up until after World War II, we didn't have much story that wasn't either written in a book or on a comic book or something like that. We made up a lot of stories, and people have always loved to make up stories. But I wanted the folks that read my books to understand that the Mescalero people of New Mexico and West Texas are real people. They're not they're not some kind of primitive human beings that had no knowledge or they just didn't live like people who had come from Europe. They were very different. They had different experiences and they were just as skilled and as advanced in their culture as we presume ours was. And the Comanches are probably the fiercest Americans in history. Their their flash on the historic pan was only a few years. But one of the things that I've come to understand, not just from my writing, but from other people's work, they loved Austin because they burned it down twice to keep people from coming. They were few, but they were mighty and they had great pride. So it was easy to write about these people. And it was hard to figure out how my grandfather and a Mescalero chief, or my great grandfather and a Mescalero chief, could learn how to coexist, but they did. And it just made a wonderful story. And there's not a word of truth in any of it.
Let's turn to runners now, because as we turn the century in the state of Texas, obviously in the eastern part of the state, Galveston rebuilt after the hurricane of 1900. It was the major port for the state of Texas, and the railroads had come across. Spindletop comes in 1901, which completely changes the character of of energy and obviously oil in Texas, but it didn't change a lot in West Texas. How did you sort of write that transition leading up to World War II and perhaps even the Roaring '20s?
I used the construction of the railroad for one thing, and I used weather a lot because as people in the hill country have found out over the last few days, it hadn't changed a bit. It's just as mean and awful as weather can get. And if you go back and look at James Michener's great book of several generations ago about Texas, he wrote incessantly about what the weather was doing to people's lives and what insects did to people's lives. And that's Texas. If you come from Germany and you get off a boat and somewhere around Port O'Connor, or I think it's Indianola was the actual name of the port down there at that point, it must have been like you had stepped on the surface of the moon. And you hadn't seen anything yet until you got to Fredericksburg. It must have been just unbelievable because they had these posters that were advertised in Europe and all of these get rich quick real estate schemes, and they thought they were probably coming to paradise. And maybe they did, but it wasn't an easy trip.
In the '20s, as we move into the Roaring '20s, of course, we have prohibition. And I think most Texans forget not only do we have a border, we got a lot of coastline,
Yes, we
which
do.
for prohibition meant there could have been a lot of rum running or importation of distilled spirits through a land route. How did that play into the storyline of Runners?
It's tragic. It is more tragic than I can understand. And for the third book, I'm still writing about some of the aftermath of it right now. I had two much older uncles, much older than my parents. One named Ralph, and he was a real person, and he was a real bootlegger, and he was a real gangster, and he bragged about it. And he had a younger brother named Glenn, who was a very tragic figure who was completely subsumed in alcohol and opium. And they came from respectable parents. Every time they'd get their names in the paper over some bloody incident or another, it was embarrassing, it was humiliating, except for the fact that they were Walter and Ada's children, and they supported their kids no matter what, no matter what. If they were in jail, my grandfather more than once drove across more than one state to get one or the other of them out of jail. And like I say, these were establishment, respectable people, but it wasn't just my family. It affected almost every family in the United States. It was a wild and bloody time, and maybe it was exciting, but it came at a huge cost.
And even at that time, there were still raids back and forth across the border. I've had the opportunity to study South Texas history, and up until 1920, there were still raids across.
It didn't stop until probably the 50s, and I don't mean that they were military actions, but you've had ranchers on both sides of that river going back and forth, stealing each other's livestock and horses, and it was some kind of mysterious game, but it just went on forever.
Could you tell us about the book you're currently working on and maybe even how far it will go into history?
It's going to get up into very close to 1960, and it's got a lot of old time Austin in it, and it focuses more on the two younger brothers, Brooks, who was my uncle, and Ray, who was my father. And it starts out with Ray's first train ride. And there wasn't one of them, there were dozens. But and it goes through some very harrowing parts of World War II. My father wasn't any big hero, but he looked at the surfaced U-boat across the water in the Gulf of Mexico more than once, ready to sink a derelict old tanker that he was a seaman on. And his brother Brooks went through all sorts of misadventures and horrendous problems in both the North Woods of Michigan, training for the invasion of World War II, of Europe in World War II, and rounding up draft dodgers in Mississippi. It, as you say, it begins after the Civil War and it goes to the brink of Vietnam.
So I was wondering if you give us some thoughts on some of the creative directions your work might go other than simply as novels.
I got a screenplay sitting right here on my desk that I'm just dying to see produced. It's for a streaming series on Netflix or one of those many services. And it was beautifully written by Texas screenwriter and fantastic actress Carla Harmon Kidd, whom I got to know through her husband, who is also an actor. And it's still a dream, but there are people interested, and I can't wait to see it on screen.
Could you say a few words about what it was like working with Lauren Steffi and the group at Stony Creek Publishing?
He's the best. I said it in front of him the other day, and I made one of the other writers pretend like Lauren couldn't hear us. He's the best editor I've ever had, and I trust him completely. I've never had an influence in writing in my life that matches what he does. And he sees great literature, great books in some of the strangest places one could possibly imagine. But every one of his writers' books I have read is worth rereading. They're all excellent. And Stony Creek, which is the name of his publishing company, is going to be heard from. It's going to succeed in a big way someday.
Phil, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I wanted to ask if our listeners wanted to connect with you, find out more about your books, where can the places they can go?
Go to stonycreekpublishing.com, go to amazon.com, Barnes and Noble, Texas A&M University Press, who actually distributes the books and takes care of the financial part of Stony Creek Publishing, in a group called Texas Book Consortium. And Barnes and Noble says they will deliver it the same day. I haven't heard anybody tell me that they really had that experience by walking into a Barnes and Noble yet, but I trust them. It won't be long, but you get them from Amazon the next morning. And if you like to read ebooks, all it takes is one click and a very few dollars, and you can read all of the books and you can preview them and see whether you really want to read them or not. We've got an audiobook coming for Little Hatchet, and I'm really excited about that too.
Phil, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to visit with me, and I hope we can continue this conversation.
I hope
And
so. I hope I
one more
haven't turned
thing,
you off. I hope you'll let me come back.
you need to come down to Kerrville and talk about your books.
You betcha.